thank you for joining us and welcoming Harry Haldt, presenting his book. He is presenting Upper Gallants and Rusty Scuppers. Harry Peale Haldt III spent countless hours putting together this collection featuring his father's adventures as a young man. Finding mementos saved by his father and his grandparents, he was able to come out with a great collection of stories in honor of his father. He is going to share with the readers the adventures of an amateur mariner.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good, and you?
All right. I will, oh, Gary. How are you? I see you have a number of ship models on your shelf behind you. You can take your mic is on mute. You want to take that off mute?
There you go.
There you go.
Good afternoon.
How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about how this book came into being, which is really is almost as interesting as some of the stories in the book itself. My name is Harry Peale Haldt III. There are two other Harrys. They all play a role in this story. My father is the one who went to sea. My grandfather was in the Navy in World War I, and his father owned some sailing schooners out of Philadelphia. So 4 generations of our family have been at sea one way or the other. I was in the Navy, active duty in Vietnam, stayed in the reserve. I retired as a Navy captain. So that's kind of where we got to the sea part of this. The story begins back in the 1930s. My father was a teenager in high school and college. Between 1931 and 1939, for 7 summers, he went to sea between ages 14 and 22. At 14 years old was his first summer, 1931. He worked on board a small freighter that went along the U.S. coast down to Central America. In 1934, he worked on board a converted fishing schooner off the Labrador and Newfoundland coast. Worked for a company called Grenfell International, which had a series of hospitals along the Labrador coast, and this schooner went supplying supplies from one town to another up along the Canadian coast. 3 years later, 1937, he worked on board a ship called the Sea Cloud. Was a 4-masted barque, was the largest private sailing lot in the world at the time, was owned by Marjorie Merriweather Post, who was the owner of General Foods. She and her husband had this ship built, and her husband at the time, her third husband, was the United States ambassador to the Soviet Union. So she used the ship to go visit the Baltic states and Russia, and my father worked on board the ship that summer. In 1939, my father worked on board a ship called the SS Benjamin Harrison. The Benjamin Harrison was a round-the-world cruise liner, and he worked on board as a steward and left New York City and went west across the Pacific, back through the Mediterranean and back to New York. So New York to New York was like 105 days. For 2 other summers during the 1930s, he didn't work at sea. He went to Europe to travel. He went by steamship. One year he went to travel around Holland, Netherlands, northern France. Another summer he worked in England, or went to visit England. And the last summer He worked on board a fishing trawler out of Boston for one quick cruise, maybe 3 to 3.5 weeks. So that's what he did. But you know, when you think about your parents, you don't usually think about your parents as what did your parents do as kids. You think about what do your parents, when do you know your parents? Well, you know when they're older and you know them as parents, but you don't usually think too much about what did your father or mother do when they were teenagers. Well, I had no idea what my father did as a teenager, so we'd really never talked about it. And this all came as a bit of a surprise. And how this happened is the 1930s, my father worked on board these ships. Go ahead 46 years. In 1983, my father's retired. He and my mother live in Florida. And my mother books a cruise, a Caribbean cruise for the two of them. By that time, the Sea Cloud, this large private yacht, was now a windjammer, was now a commercial ship, was doing cruises. So my mother found this out and decided she would surprise my father by booking a cruise on board the Sea Cloud, a ship that my father had worked on 46 years earlier as a young man. So they did. Of course, my mother didn't tell him that. She just said, we're going on a cruise. And my father just acknowledged, yes, dear, that's fine. Just tell me where I need to be and when I need to be there. So he didn't know the ship that he was going on until they got to the pier. Walked down the pier, he recognized it immediately what ship it was on, started to cry, broke down, had the most fantastic cruise, spent the whole time running all around the ship, invited to look at everywhere, talk to the crew. The crew was now men and women, was only men when my father worked on board. So he spent the whole time telling them stories about what it was like when he worked on board, and he wanted to find out what it was like now when they were working on board, girls, boys, and so forth. So they had a wonderful cruise. They had a great exchange of stories. My father went back home, back to Florida, talked to his friends, started telling them about stories about that cruise. Of course, that brought back some memories. So he started talking to him about when he worked on board the ship. That brought on some more stories of, well, and previous summers, I worked on board this ship and this happened. So it kind of grew, and a couple of people said, Peale, our middle name is Peale, that's the name he went by. Peale, these stories are really good. You ought to write a book. Well, unbeknownst to anyone in the family, his wife and my sister and myself, my father did write a book. But he never told anybody about it. He wrote it, typed it, and it went into a folder someplace, and it stayed there. My father died in the year 2000. My mother moved back up to New York from Florida. When she got back up, she said to me, I have some family boxes of things that I'm getting tired of lugging around. I think you should have these. So there were like 2 or 3 large cardboard boxes of family paraphernalia and so forth. So I said, sure, I'll take them and I'll go through them. I took them to my house. I put them in the attic and promptly never looked at them. For about 18 years, my wife and I, a couple of years ago, were getting ready for a yard sale. We started to go through a lot of our books, a lot of our boxes. And my wife said, you really should go through, why don't we look through those boxes that your mother gave us? So I did. I opened them up and started going through them, and I found 2 or 3 copies of Life magazine back from the 40s and 50s, a folder marked 50th, my father's 50th graduation party from college. I found my parents' wedding album, found a couple of folders, found some old register books like accounting ledgers, boxes, some old White Owl cigar boxes. I found all kinds of things. And going through them, one of the things I found was a folder. And the folder was, I'm going to show you, the folder was this. It said story, written by H.P.H. Jr. So it was just a manila folder like this. And inside this folder was the typed copy of this book, Upper To-gallants and Rusty Scuppers. So I opened this up and started to look at it. And here's a typed copy. It's typed, it's got diagrams, it's got pictures that my father drew. Parts of it is a part of a knife. So I said, wonder what else is in here. So I then took a look at some of the other documents that I found, some of the other things that I found in there. And I found some ledger books, look like this, just regular accounting ledger books. I opened these up and I found that these were actually the diaries that my father kept during the summers when he worked on board these ships. So every ship that he worked on, there was a corresponding diary. They made it look like that. Another one looked like this. It says scrapbook. Harry Peale Haldt, June 4th to July 27th. This was 1931 on the first book that he worked on, the first ship that he worked on. So I kept digging. I then found 4 boxes like this, White Owl cigars, rolled regular White Owl cigar boxes. These boxes, all 4 of these boxes were full of letters that my father had written home and his parents had written back to him. So there were like, 5 or 6 years worth of letters. I read through every one of these letters. Some of the handwriting, some of them were handwritten, some of them were typed. What else did I find? I found a whole stack of blank negatives, just dark negatives, just old-fashioned, big, old-fashioned, this size negatives. I had these all taken down to a print shop, had them printed up. So now I had about 30 photographs. I had no idea what they were because nothing was labeled, of course. I then had little 35 millimeter pictures that also were in there of people, of ships. I had no idea what any of those were because none of those were labeled. I found brochures, I found maps, I found luggage stickers for a lot of the hotels that when he on his round the world cruise. I found back in those days when you had a trunk, when they made sure to get your luggage to the right hotel, they would just slap a sticker on your trunk and it was delivered. So here's a label for the Gloucester Hotel in Hong Kong, the Raffles Hotel in Singapore, the Taj Mahal Hotel in Bombay, now Mumbai. I found all kinds of stuff. I found a packet of letters specially tied up, addressed to my father, something special about these letters, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But I found all of these things, and I said, wow, my father did all these things, did all this stuff when he was in high school and college. Why? My father's just a regular, his father was a manager at General Foods. My father lived in northern New Jersey, just a regular teenager. He ran track in high school. He skied when he was in college. What was he doing? What was all this time spent going to sea during the summer? And I couldn't figure out what all this was about. In and amongst all the letters that I found in those boxes of cigars, I found a letter that my grandfather wrote to my father in 1932, the second year he was doing any of this, going anywhere. And it kind of explained why my father was doing this. My grandfather told him in this letter that he thought it would probably make a lot of sense in growing up for someone to understand what's going on in the world, to see the world. So his plan was, and it says, on account of his manly, that is, gentlemanly actions, his mom and papa said to each other, What a fine man we have made of this little boy. We're not only proud of him, but also his girlfriend, and he can be proud of himself. We're going to send him to the West Indies, Holland, South Africa, England, the Mediterranean, Brazil, Gloucester fishermen, Australia, and around the world. Have him put through Dartmouth and give him a year at a European university. Now, he wrote that in 1932. By 1939, my father had done probably was sent to 2/3 of those places, and in fact did graduate from college and was planning on going to a university in Europe. He had been accepted to go to Cambridge. So my grandfather had a plan for my father to have him see all these places. The way it turned out that my father saw them was to get there by working on ships during the summer. So that's kind of how, why he went to sea. How they picked and how he chose the ships that he was going to work on, I really don't know, since nobody in the family knew that he had done this, written this, and nobody really talked about it. My father died in 2000. I found out about all this stuff in 2018. I have about 1,000 questions I'd like to ask him. The one starting off of, why did you do all this? Why did you happen to pick this form of going around the world and doing the things that your father said? I don't have the answers to any of those things, unfortunately. But what I do have is I do have all this documentation. I was living in Athol at the time. I then went to a book publisher there, local publisher, and said, I have all this stuff. What do you think about making a book? I don't know why my father ended up with just the typed version of it. Why it never turned into a book, I don't know. But she said, sure, I think we can do this. And I worked on this for about a year, putting together the stories that he had in his manuscript and taking all of this information that I had and combining this, putting them all into a book. So what I did is I took highlights of some of the ledgers and some of the diaries. I took all of his stories just the way he wrote them. I took some of the diagrams, the luggage stickers, the photographs that I actually was able to identify, and put them with the corresponding stories and parts of the logbook. And that's how this book came into being. So it's a story that started out in the 1930s and it ended up in 2019. So it took a while to put this all together and make this into something, but it was a project I just had to finish. So that was, I'm not an author. I'm a retired banker. I have nothing to do. I'm the last person in the world who would be writing a book, but I figured this was important enough to not let these stories die, to just keep them alive, get them out so that other people could enjoy them. And some of the things are really kind of funny, and I'll just give you a couple of examples of that. In his first logbook, which he wrote, and it's all in pencil, which is really hard to read when it's like 85 years old. But I went through that, and there was a highlight of one of the things that he wrote about that I thought might be kind of interesting. And I'm going to tell you what that is in just a second. This is the way he wrote that. This is a 14-year-old boy writing this. Friday the 5th, 1931. We didn't sleep very well last night. The watch was out there and we went out about 1 a.m. Later, Captain Brinch, pronounced Brinch, came out. Gee, he's a swell guy, no kidding. About 7:30, we sighted an old oil tanker and a steamer of the United Fruit Company. We just came back from a stroll around the ship. Haven't sighted land since last night. Saw a bunch of porpoises, ran for our cameras. Sun was under the cloud, but we tried. The school passed within about 20 feet of the stern, but our camera finger wasn't swift enough to get the pictures. Sorry to disappoint you. Well, at last, Mount Peale erupted. Boy, was I sick. Spuds, ink, small nails, etc. are all fish food now. So he obviously had a little bit too much to drink, or it was a little rough that night, got a little sick. And so that's a 14-year-old's describing that particular event. One of the other things that I found was he liked to talk about people. He was very observant and liked to talk about the people. On board the ship, the George B. Cluett, which was the schooner that went off up the Canadian coast. He had a crew of like 5 or 6 people. They would just go port to port. They would go to port A, and port A, they needed to deliver some coal to port B. So they would put on the coal at A, unload it at port B. And port B, they were going to put on some lumber, which needed to go to the next port. So they then load and unload the lumber. They'd go to the next port. They needed to transport some cows from C to D, whatever it was, point to point to point, and then bringing medical supplies to the hospitals. And they just went up and down the coast doing that for the summer. So he described, one of the people on board was the cook. They called him Cookie. Our Cookie was quite a character. Not only did he concoct meals out of nowhere, but he also had 2 special kettles on the back of the galley stove. One contained what he called coffee, and the other, he insisted, was tea. Both liquids were thick, black, and guaranteed to warm up a body as long as it was still alive. The contents of either pot also guaranteed that the drinker would be wide awake during his 4-hour watch, and maybe for some time after, if one managed to swallow more than 1 cupful. Only by smell could we tell which was which. If you wanted coffee and got tea, you could arrange to swap with someone who had made the mistake in reverse. And if you added a lot of sugar and tinned milk, you could accept it as a drink of pleasure rather than a drink of necessity. Watching Cookie make the stuff was unbelievable, and you could make a water drinker out of you if you weren't careful. He would take a handful of coffee and just ground and dump it into one of the pots. Tea leaves he would dump into the other pot. Never did any of us see him mix up the procedure, although I'm not sure we could have told the difference anyway. We learned to love the damn stuff, and we considered anyone a sissy who couldn't put down a cup or 2 at one sitting. When one of his pots got half full of grounds or leaves, he simply dumped it over the side and started all over again. So that's kind of how my father wrote stories. I can sit down and I can just picture everything that he's talking about. It's really pretty simple. It's just, every time I read a story, I'm just trying to think back of the father I knew and what he was like when he was younger and having to go through all of these adventures that he went on. Sea Cloud was the next ship that he went on, 1937. As I said, this was owned by Marjorie Merriweather Post, the woman who built Mar-a-Lago in Florida, the owner of General Foods. She had a daughter. Her daughter's name was Nedenia Hutton. At the time, Mrs. Post was married to Edward F. Hutton of E.F. Hutton, the investment company. So the 2 of them had a few dollars to scratch together. So they had this yacht built. They built this back in 1931. It was built in Germany. And again, as I said, it was the largest private sailing yacht in the world at the time. So my father reported on board that ship in Jacksonville, Florida. And they were going across the Atlantic, going into the Baltic, visit some of the Baltic countries, and eventually ended up in St. Petersburg, where her husband, Mr. Davies, would do his U.S. ambassador thing and go see the government in Moscow. But he writes on his first day, the first day the bosun checked out his brand new seaman by telling him to climb the rigging over the towering mainmast. I leaned back, stared aloft at the forest of mast, topmast, yard, white with furled sails that seemingly miles of hemp lines. Some of the lines, tarred standing rigging, shone black, but most, the more pliable running rigging, were light. The boatswain was not going to be disappointed in his new sailor, I'd see to that. So up I went in the prescribed manner, 1 foot on each rattling on either side of the brace. I stayed outside of the lubber's hole where the topmast joins the mainmast at the first spreader, climbed up on the lower topmast to its spreader, swung onto the upper topmast, climbed to its step, and then saw the last 15 or 20 feet were straight up with rope rungs about 8 inches wide. Up till then, my climb had not proved very difficult thanks to my experiences on the schooner Cluet. Climbing wide, slanting ratlins compares with something like climbing a great extension ladder leaning against the familiar side of a house. However, the last climb from the top of the upper topmast of the truck was a different matter. The tiny mast there did not measure much larger around than your arm, with the tarred rope ladder completely vertical, so you had to lean back to climb. I finally made it, hung tight, and made my first mistake. I looked down. Far below on the little narrow deck that looked like a canoe from up there stood the boatswain and a couple of other interested people, all with their heads thrown back, staring aloft. I guess they fully expected me to freeze and wondered which unlucky fellow was going to have to climb aloft to pry me loose and get me back on the deck. I determined that that would not happen. Something I had not counted on did happen, however, and now you'll be the only one to know. On deck, a slow, normal dockside roll becomes greatly exaggerated a couple of 100 feet in the air. I swayed in a good-sized arc, first out over the pier and then out over the water, or so it seemed at that great height. For the first time in my seagoing life, I got seasick while tied up to the dock. I could see me splattering the deck and being clapped in irons, keel hauled, put on bread and water for the duration, and given 15 lashes with a cat o' nine tails. I guess I turned green. I threw up, but I swallowed faster. I came down to the deck in record time, evidently passed the boatswain's test, and rushed below, where I finished my job in privacy. So his first day on board ship, he got sick, but things all went up from there. So one of the other events that happened on board the ship was he was a member of one of the two-man crews. For the ship had 2 launches to get people back and forth from the ship to land, and he was a member of one of the crews. So one time when they were in port visiting Sweden, they were assigned to go pick up some people and bring them out to see Mrs. Post and her husband. So they picked up a man and his wife, and the gentleman was an older gentleman, he'd just come in from playing tennis, had a blue jacket and white pants and white sneakers and a white cap on, and came on board. And my father then, they took off from the dock and started heading out to the ship. And the gentleman started to have a conversation with my father, asked him, who he was, where you're from, well, from the United States. What do you do? Well, he was a junior in college at the time, and told him that, where'd you go to school? He said, oh, I went to some little school I'm sure you've never heard of, Colgate University in upstate New York. And the gentleman said, oh, I know Colgate University. A friend of mine's son went to school there. Well, the gentleman that my father was speaking to at the time happened to be the King of Sweden. He didn't know it. I didn't know it until I read it. And that's one of the photographs, one of the negatives that I uncovered was a picture of this gentleman. And again, there was nothing marked on it, so I didn't know who it was at the time, but only after reading the book. And this is the picture. This is the gentleman, white cap, black shoes, blue jacket, white tie. That's the picture that I saw. And I said, oh, so that must be the King of Sweden. And my father had this little conversation with him that day. So you never quite know who you're going to meet. Another one of the people that he met on board was he met the owner's daughter, Nedenia Hutton. Nedenia Hutton was 14 years old that summer. My father was 20. And as it turned out, whatever relationship they had while he worked on board, they maintained a relationship for the following year. And the reason I know that is because this packet of letters that I found neatly wrapped up are all letters from Nedenia Hutton written to my father over the succeeding 12 months when she was in private school and he was in school, just corresponding back and forth for a year. Now, of course, I don't have the half of the letters that my father wrote, so I don't know what he said. I only know what she said. And I transcribed all these letters in the back of the book. And they all have kind of one thing in common. They all kind of start off saying things like, "Dearest Peale, thanks loads for the 2 swell letters." Or it would say, "Dear Peale, thanks so much for the nice long letter. I'm afraid I can't do as well as that, but I'll try." Or, "Dearest Peale, will you please forgive me for not writing you sooner?" And these are all fairly lengthy letters, but they're the letters of a 14-year-old girl who went to school at Mount Vernon Seminary in Washington, D.C. that year. Mount Vernon Seminary is now part of George Washington University. But they wrote letters back and forth, and my father must have written some pretty good letters because her letters are really very interesting. So these were not in the part of the book that he wrote. I added these to the back of the book because I thought that they were very interesting and kind of an integral part of his story about working on board the Sea Cloud. He then, in 1939, he worked on board the ship called the Benjamin Harrison. Benjamin Harrison is this freighter that's on the bottom. It's a freighter and passenger ship. Would go around the world, made stops, about 20 stops along the way. And a good part of this book is his experiences on board that ship. Again, he was a steward on board, which, as he describes in here, is kind of the lowest of the low people that working on board the ship. But he has some rather interesting adventures and met some really strange people and went to some really strange places along the way. One of them is he met, let me see which one I want to tell you about here. This one is kind of, the shoe shine. He went to Hong Kong, and one of the things that they did in Hong Kong was, in Hong Kong we saw shops, stalls, carts, and peddlers everywhere. You could buy anything cheap. One shop sold everything ivory, another everything brass, another handmade shoes, another unknown smoked meats. There I received the opportunity to smoke some opium. Evil-looking, skinny Chinese men offered to show us sailors all kinds of pleasures: tattoos, cheap drinks, beautiful girls, gems at half price, white sharkskin suits, opium, and any other diversions we could think of. A sailor has the reputation of making a lot of money doing nothing, constantly looking for women, drinking as much as he can in as short a time as possible. He's a fair game for con men, pimps, and rollers from one end of the earth to the other. The tattoo was another matter. So he talks about this tattoo parlor that he went into. He really wanted to get a tattoo, but he resisted. He just said, "No, I just couldn't do it." But then he says, years later in Singac, New Jersey, a World War II vet opened a short order restaurant under the inverted tail of a heavy bomber where he had fought the war. He had some beautiful arm tattoos that caught my eye. I'd asked if he'd ever been to a certain little side street parlor in Hong Kong. He admitted he had, and we were instant buddies. Sure enough, he'd been to the same artist. His masterpiece, however, was a multicolored dragon that wrapped itself around his arm. So he recognized the tattoo, and years later, he met somebody who had been to the same tattoo parlor. So there are about 82, 83 stories in this book of the adventures that my father had during those 4 summers that he worked on board the ships. Again, ages 14 to ages 22 when he was 4 years in high school, went to prep school, and went to college for 4 years. So that accounted for the 9 years. So 5 out of those 9 years he worked on board these ships. 4 of those summers ended up being the stories in this book. And it's something that once I had all this information and collected all this and looked at it, it's something that I just said, I just need to put this together. I just need to finish the project that he started and be able to share these stories with other people. So that's the reason that my name is on the book as well as my father's. It's his stories, and I'm just the one that kind of took all his stuff together and put it together in this particular book. I really enjoyed writing it. I found out a whole lot about my father that I really didn't know, and like I said, it made me ask more questions than I could ever possibly answer. I would love to be able to speak to him. Sometime I will be able to, and maybe get the answers to some of those questions. But right now I have a whole bunch I just don't know. But I experienced some of the same things that he did. I was in the Navy, I was in the Pacific. So I did get to Hong Kong, I did get to Manila, I did get to Japan, I did get to Hawaii. I got to some of the same ports. And there's a little section in the back of the book where I kind of reminisce a little bit about doing some of the same things that my father did when he was there, many decades before I was there. So that's kind of what this story and what this book is all about. You have any questions I could answer for you?
Well, I just want to just tell you that it's been very interesting listening to you. And it kind of reminds me, because I've always been interested in ships and the waterfront.
I can tell by your bookcase.
So I grew up down in Southeast Baltimore, and so my playgrounds were the rail yards and the port.
Sure.
So, and that was in the days when before the big ships.
Right.
And so what wasn't hard to go down to any particular part of the waterfront and see ships from any part of the world and sailors from the part of the world from different parts of the world. And it was just a strange and wonderful place. On occasion, because I had a friend whose grandfather worked at a ship chandler shop, had occasion to help out down there. And ever since then, I've been interested in ships. I think it was when my mother took me as a 4 or 5 or 6-year-old, I can't remember, to down to the Pier 4 in Pratt Street to see the old naval ship Constellation, the old sailing vessel.
Right.
When she first came into Baltimore. And to a lot of people's eyes, it didn't look like much in those days. It looks pretty good right now. But I thought it was just fascinating. So I was just hooked then. And hearing you talk, it reminded me of a number of conversations that I've had with folks at our little museum in Hillsborough. Our historical society has the Heritage Museum here, and I'm one of the 2 curators. And when people have some things to donate, collections of pictures, family collections of this and that, they tell stories in the same way you just told your father's story. They're also, in fact, as a matter of fact, as I'm sitting here, over here, there's a pile of boxes. Guess from what? My family, my mother and father. Yeah. So that I'm trying to do the same thing that you've done with your father. So yeah, so I understand where you're coming from. My mother's from England, and some of that stuff comes from over there. So it's been real interesting. I've been lucky to get out on the ocean a few times with my wife, and like I say, I've followed ships all around. And when my wife said that she saw something on Facebook or whatever that is, because I'm not very good with computers, so she got me hooked in. She mentioned sea cloud, and I knew what that was, and
Right.
so I'm like, okay, yeah, bring it on. I'll listen. Yeah. So so it sounds like your dad lived an interesting life, working ships in the coastal trade, and then getting into the international stuff, working for the President line. So it sounds very interesting, and so I hope Toad still keeps a copy of your book over there in Keene, because I'll pick it up.
Yeah, they have some copies over there.
Great.
You can certainly pick it up from them. But yeah, this was just so much fun doing, and every new envelope I opened up, and every letter that I read, and every folder that I found was something new, and something saying, and just in the back of my head all the time was, Dad, why didn't you tell us this stuff?
Yeah.
Why didn't you share this with us so that we could have done a lot and had these experiences along with you? And it just wasn't to be.
Yeah, I understand that 100%, to tell you the truth. I wonder about the same things about my dad, and I'm like, nah, that's not my dad, but it was my dad. So, what you gonna do? And it is satisfying to find out some of these things.
One of the two things. I'll just end with this two little stories. One of them, when he was on the President lines, he ended up in Singapore on September 2nd, 1939. September 2nd, 1939 is when England declared war on Germany. So my father was on a neutral American ship in the large British naval station outside of England, halfway around the world. My father being half English, my grandfather was scared to death that my father would jump ship and join the British Navy. So he basically sent him a telegram, stay on board, just come on back home. And so he didn't want to tell him not to do it, because he figured if he told him not to do it, my father probably would do it. So he kind of hinted around it and said, happy birthday, son. Stay on board. We'll see you when you get home.
Yeah, stay on board a ship with that American flag on it. Yeah. 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 At the time.
And he talks all about they painted the American flag all over the ship and everything, because they had to come back home through the Suez Canal, through the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
So they basically had to pass through a war zone to get home.
Yes, they did. Yeah.
So they were very concerned about all that.
Yeah.
Also, when he was on board the Sea Cloud in 1937, they made several stops in Germany, and he talks all about the buildup of the German Navy, seeing Nazi soldiers everywhere, taking illegal pictures that he wasn't supposed to take. Matter of fact, one of the pictures that I was able to identify was of a German battleship, and it ended up being the Graf Spee, which was in port in Kiel, Germany at the time. And I was able to identify that by looking at his picture and then looking at the ship itself. Totally illegal. Cameras were not supposed to be anywhere. He walked around with a camera under a blanket or towel or whatever he did, snapping these pictures. So I have a number of photographs like that that were very interestingly that I was able to identify. But all these things that I found, and the more I dug, the more I found.
I just think it's interesting and I look forward to reading some of the descriptions of basically what it was like just to be a seaman at that particular time. Like I say, working the coastal trade and then working the ships that went to other nations.
Yep,
It had to be fascinating in a number of ways. Yeah.
It is. It's a view of the world of the 1930s through the eyes of an American teenager and young man on his own around the world.
Yeah.
And it's a very interesting viewpoint. And he talks about things and words that he used or things that may not be appropriate today, but it's the way he described it in the 1930s.
Yeah. No, I look forward to it, and I appreciate you taking the time to talk about it.
Well, thank you very much. And I do hope you enjoy the book. It was really a lot of fun doing.
I'm sure I will, and good luck with getting through the rest of all those papers you got over there. we both got the same.
Good luck with your boxes too.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that very much. Yeah,
so dig right into them.
I will, believe me. I've been on the phone with the relatives in England in the past for quite a bit. So
there you go.
You betcha. Well, thank you very much, and good luck with it.
Certainly. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye now.
Thank you so much for joining us and welcoming him here and everything. And we'll get this recording posted on our website later. And yeah, that was a great presentation.
Great. Thank you very much. That was very enjoyable. Had a lot of fun.
Same here. Okay. Bye-bye.
Take care now. All
Have
right.
a good
Bye-bye.
day. Bye.